Hello and welcome to Focus on Liberia. Always answering say the hour of politics. Welcome. Do all that. Use your favor. The network is all about educating, elevating the disco, and also promoting all things Liberia. Welcome, and we cannot welcome you enough for always tuning in here. Focus on Liberia. We want to say thank you. I have a guest and we have a topic, and this one is much more international. There's a reason for that. We are about to talk about war crimes quote. This time, not the one in Liberia. People are talking about one for a most powerful leader, for one of the most powerful leaders in the world, Mr. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. Really? Can they do that? We have the experts seated to do that for us. Oh my goodness. Sorry there, folks. Somebody is bothering me here. Um, the expert is seated and he's going to help us understand the whole thing about war crime quote, possibly for Mr. Vladimir Putin. Are they going to do that? My guest is Mr. Ahmed K. Sirleaf. Mr. Sirleaf, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you, Anthony. It's always a pleasure to be back on Focus on Liberia. I'm happy to engage with the audience.
Thank you. And a little about our guest, Ahmed K. Sirleaf, for 6 years taught defense and security at the Kofi Annan Institute for Conflict Transformation at the University of Liberia's Graduate School in Liberia. A former international justice program officer at the Advocates for Human Rights in Minneapolis. He earned a master's in public international law at the United Nations Mandate University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica, and took courses in national security policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, where he is currently a doctoral student of a researcher. Now, more details about Mr. Sirleaf is he's a security and public international law specialist. These are specifics about him. He's a global policy and conflict specialist. And also, he is the principal at the BP Medina Group, that is LLC. Again, Mr. Sirleaf, it's good to have you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for those kind words and introduction. Like you said, this is a very internationalized and international subject. Sometimes our Liberian audiences question, like I recall when we last were on your show speaking about, just doing analysis of what was going on between Russia and Ukraine and the sort of global implications globally. People were saying, why are you Liberians here talking about Russia when you should be talking about LEC? So I'm really happy that in the outset there, you lay out why it's important for us as Liberians to engage in these types of discourses that are happening around us and in our global community. So I'm honored to be here. Thank you. You could have invited any other Liberian experts. So many of them are there, more qualified. But I'm delighted that you reach out to me, and let's get into it.
Thank you. Talking about getting into it, let us get to it then. First of all, the whole issue of war crimes, crimes against humanity, you, the expert, will also go further to say international humanitarian crimes. These are very serious crimes from what we read, those of us in the media. And to see that the Russian president is being accused of committing these kind of crimes, people are like, can they actually go after him? Because they are talking about it. So talk to me, first of all, when we say war crimes, what are war crimes for the ordinary man to understand here?
Thank you, Anthony. So war crimes are codified rules that are
Mhm,
set out in the four Geneva Conventions of 12 August 1949. So
mhm,
after World War II, the international community got together, just like they established the United Nations
mhm,
in 1945 for the sole objective of the maintenance of international peace and security. So too, the follow-up of various treaties,
mhm,
including the four Geneva Conventions that we will go in depth in talking about,
mhm,
uh, and further codify additional rules in what they call the 1977 additional protocols, as well as in 2005 they came. So it's like um, over certain periods of time, the international community, given what's happening in the world, goes back and reviews those rules and amend something. So the rules are meant for states that are involved in armed conflict,
mhm,
during armed conflict, to protect civilians and to minimize the impact of armed conflict on civilians and on people who are no longer involved in armed conflict. So, for example, somebody could have been an active combatant,
mhm,
the fighting, the military person, or the militarized individual carrying arm or ammunition and just actively engaging in the war. They got captured, or they got wounded, or they decided that they don't want to fight anymore. They give it up, raise their hands. That person now is no longer actively engaging in the war. So
mhm,
you otherwise known sometimes as prisoners of war. You protect them. You protect civilians. You protect civilians' infrastructure. You are under obligations, and I'm using you, meaning states that are engaged in armed conflict, active
mhm,
armed conflict. You are under obligations to ensure that civilian corridors, like humanitarian corridors, are not tampered with, that you do not use certain weaponries that just wantonly destroys infrastructure, kills, harms people, and that women and children. So basically, bottom line is that certain protected classes uh, that are that ought to be protected and not be impacted by armed conflict. So, for instance, some of what we've been seeing in Ukraine, right? Civilians in Bucha, civilians in Mariupol and other cities where they bound their hands or bounded behind their backs, and they seem to have been shot in the head or just executed and things like that. Or the allegation that the Russian military actively blocked civilian humanitarian corridor for
mhm.
civilians to leave, which was agreed upon during a peace talk. Those sort of things consider violations of those sort of rules can
Okay.
be considered war crimes. We can go into some of the specifics. There are principles or arcing sort of principles that are around each of these things that I've talked about. There's some technical details and things like that. Maybe in the course of the conversation, we can talk a little bit about some of those and unpack them.
And so let us look into who determines, right, what all constitute war crimes. Are there institutions in charge who more like look at the involvement of other warring faction groups or
Mhm.
state uh, 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 securities involved in conflict? Who actually make the determination that, hey, there's a war crime here, hey, there's an international humanitarian crimes here? Who does that?
Well, as I said in my initial opening uh, attempt to answer your question, the
Mhm,
war crimes are laws. They are part of what's called international law. There are three
mhm,
overlapping systems of international law.
mhm,
You have international humanitarian law, which applies during armed conflict
mhm,
only. You have international human rights law, which applies during both armed conflict and peacetime. And then you have international criminal law. With those sort of three overlapping uh, separate but reinforcing components, you have a system of law that protects and codifies those and set out rules that I've spoken about earlier, right?
Mhm.
Uh, you, these rules come out of the four Geneva Conventions of
Okay.
1949 that I talked
Mhm.
about. And then there's what's called the International Law Commission. The
Mhm.
International Law Commission is a United Nations entity that looks at matters of international law,
Mhm.
that codifies and writes or passes opinions on matters bordering on on international legal issues. And then there's also precedents of the International Court of Justice.
Okay.
There are um, various tribunals that have been established in the past, specialized tribunals, and now we have a permanent International Criminal Tribunal, the ICC.
Okay. So, how are indictments, charges about war crimes, international humanitarian or crimes or drawn? What's the process?
Well, now, I mean, the last time I was here on your show,
Mhm.
I indicated to you that the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court,
Mhm.
Karim Khan,
Mhm.
announced that he had launched an initial investigation into Russia's invasion of Ukraine,
Okay.
and the events that border on what many have described as violations of war crimes,
Mhm.
as crimes against humanity. President Zelensky even says that it's what's happening in Ukraine, what Russia is doing in Ukraine, can be characterized as a genocide, right?
Mhm.
So, in order to sort of unpack some of those, you have to understand the context here. Maybe let's build a basis, right?
Okay.
Russia is not a member of the International Criminal Court. So
Okay.
too is Ukraine. United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court as well.
Okay.
And during the negotiation in 2002 of the constitutive statute of the ICC, what's known as the Rome Statute of the ICC,
Mhm.
United States was there. They participated in the negotiation. They signed onto the treaty. They made sure that there was certain language in how they wanted it. But United States did not uh, move so that the U.S. Senate could ratify the ICC statute. So United States is not a member, and these three countries are not. And in order for a matter to be under the jurisdiction of the ICC, a number of things have to happen. First, you have to be an ICC member state,
Okay.
and or the violations have to have occurred, have to have been allegedly done by a citizen of the ICC member state,
Right.
or that ICC member states have to bring the matter to the attention of the into the chief prosecutor, so
Okay.
that then the chief prosecutor can, under what's called the good offices of those member states, investigate and look into the matter to see whether or not and collect evidence to basically determine a number of uh, principles of law, like try to determine criminality, basically, whether there was an intent, whether these rules, that is, these principles of international law, the principle of precaution, the principle of proportionality, and whether those principles have been violated, and the manner of violation, what sort of weaponry or weapons are used in a particular armed conflict, and whether a commander or a military general or certain head of state pass
Mhm.
certain give certain order for a specific act that it's against civilians, or it gravely impacted civilians, right? So there are a number of complications here. You have to determine intention, you have to determine command and control, determine intentionality, whether or not what happened was of military necessity or not. If it was in say a military object or a military or militarized individual, because the difference is there, right? There are people who, for instance, the territorial defense force in Ukraine,
Mhm.
ordinary citizens, people from all around the world who showed up and say, we want to help you defend your country. We don't have military training. And then, 1 or 2 days, maybe train them how to shoot and hold a javelin and things like that. And then they weaponize them and say, go and fight. These are militarized individuals. And then you have the Ukrainian army, military personnel. You have the Russian army, Russian military personnel. So there are all kinds of distinction there. Bottom line, investigate, look at the type of violation, people who are impacted, infrastructure and type of objects that are impacted, whether not the military necessity, military object, or not the wanton nature of destruction. If it was just wanton way, you're shooting, you're killing, and now you're thinking about the impact of your action. Those are bases for initial investigation to collect evidence, determine whether laws have been violated.
Thank you for the distinction there. But you mentioned that the U.S. is not signatory to the ICC. Russia isn't. Ukraine isn't. So these are non-members. And I would think that because they are non-members, the ICC jurisdiction does not extend to them. Now you have Ukraine that is alarming that, hey, there are war crimes here. You have the U.S., a non-member, also saying there are war crimes being committed here. Now they are raising these accusations against another non-member of the ICC, which is Russia. So the question is, when non-members are complaining, alleging about a non-member, how is that the ICC business? Does the ICC have any jurisdiction to intervene in this case?
Yes, under technicality, there's what's called, which I described earlier, the good offices of member state.
Mm-hmm.
So in order for the matter to be fall within the purview or under the jurisdiction of the ICC, member countries have to be involved. Member countries have to indicate interest and concerns and how it impacts them. And so they can invite the ICC, the chief prosecutor, to open an investigation based on how this conflict impacts those member states, and that those member states are declaring that they've been invited by the non-member state to participate and help them defend themselves. This whole idea of collective self-defense in Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. So yeah, there are some ways, some legal ways that is possible, but it's not like you rightly indicated an outright matter of ICC jurisdiction at all. Before prosecutor can open investigations in what's happening in Ukraine, about 39 member states collectively decided that they wanted the ICC to begin to look at what was happening in Ukraine.
Now, we are talking about possible war crimes or indictment and maybe subsequently a prosecution for Russian President Vladimir Putin. My understanding that he is one of the world powers, right? Or he represents a country that is one of the world powers. Is there any history since this whole world power was constituted where one has ever been, prosecuted or indicted and investigated for any war crimes? Do we have any history like that to think that this might even become a possibility?
The answer to the question is yes. There is precedent for this. There are historically in Europe and other places have been tribunals of various kinds, and some of which involved certain heads of state and former heads of state. So, for example, following World War II, the Allied power decided that they were going to prosecute surviving Axis powers nations. And interest, ironically, a country that was the member of the Allied power was also the Soviet Union. So you had Great Britain, the Soviet Union, you have France, and the United States. they established what was called the International Military Tribunal, the IMT. And that was also the IMT of the Far East. The IMT collectively, including 12 additional tribunals that the United States will institute later and try various generals of the Nazi Party of Germany following World War II, and what happened, to Jews during that period and during that war. So the Nuremberg trials happened, and actually some principles now the international law emerged out of the Nuremberg trials. So, for instance, it used to be that soldiers will say, "I was just carrying out order. It was my general order that I do this, and now you say it is a crime, and so I am absolved from any legal responsibility." The Nuremberg trial established that an individual military personnel, or soldier, or a militarized person can be liable for the action, the individual or collective action in wartime, and so too a head of state. And we'll come to that. But in more recent times, Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia was brought before the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and was prosecuted. Unfortunately, he died just before a verdict was reached. Right, so he was prosecuted for crimes against Bosnian Croats, ethnic Albanians, Bosnian Croats, and what happened in Srebrenica and other cities in that part of Europe. So yes, there's precedence for that, and it's happened in Europe in particular. In other regions, we saw, even in Europe still, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, actually that's where Milosevic was tried, not at the ICC. I correct myself there. And in other parts of the world, we saw the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR, to prosecute ethnic Tutsis who committed genocide against ethnic Hutus, minority Hutus in Rwanda in 1994. We also saw a certain head of state, our own Charles Taylor, was brought to the Special Court of Sierra Leone. That was a hybrid court organized by the United Nations at the invitation of a member state, which was Sierra Leone, and prosecuted Mr. Taylor at The Hague by that court. And now we know what's happening to him. In Latin America, several heads of state, Augustus Pinochet and others, have been brought before tribunals for crimes, alleged war crimes, and crimes against humanity and genocide during their reigns.
And I like the way you lay it out, giving some instances and examples of leaders who were held accountable as some war crime tribunals there. But the individuals you name, they might be, one might argue they are a little different. You're talking about Vladimir Putin here. His country is a member of the United Nations Security Council that has a veto power. Mm-hmm. Now, how can this be possible when he has the veto power at the United Nations? The people you named, they had no veto power. They are not member of the United Nations Security Council. I'm not sure of that. You can correct me there.
Well, that's a very good question, Anthony. Because Russia has a way of using the Security Council against the Security Council, against the international community. So that's a very excellent, legitimate concern there. Also, your concern is consistent with what we've seen even in all these war crimes trials and tribunals I've named. A certain head of state, and these, so just for some context, these trials take very long time. It takes many years. This is not just something we can arrest Putin today and indict Putin and bring him before the ICC or some kind of specialized tribunal, whatever the case will end up to be, right? So historically, it's taken very long time. It takes long time to do this. Also, the only way I see Mr. Putin being brought before the ICC or some kind of tribunal will be when he's no longer in power, right? Before then he'll be indicted. Or if there was some kind of international arrest warrant for him, and he travels to some unfriendly countries or countries that are of the ICC that want him and to go ahead and enforce that ICC indictment against Mr. Putin. Those are the possibilities. Finally, it's going to be what I'm hearing international criminal law experts talk about when I read reports and I follow this closely. They're saying it's going to be difficult because, as I lay out earlier on, you have in criminal law, there are two major elements that have to be present in order for an allegation to constitute crime. You have to have the intent, and you have to have the actual action. So you're talking about going through the painstaking work of determining whether what we're seeing happen to civilians in Ukraine were ordered by President Putin, that he knew about them. That was part of a sort of a grand strategy to meet their military objective in Ukraine. That's one. So to do that is going to be very complicated. Also, the generals on the war front, who are in control of these soldiers, whether or not they too give orders to commit these kinds of atrocities that we're seeing in Ukraine today. And so there's some work to be done. It's not going to be a walk in the park. It will take all kinds of experts. It will take all kinds of nations, a coalition of the international community, perhaps the United Nations Security Council resolution of some sort to effect some arrest if you wanted to indict Mr. Putin himself.
So how likely and unlikely is it for Vladimir Putin to face this much talk about war crime tribunal? And if he will likely be indicted, all right, what will be the ICC or a specialized tribunal? Would that be the ICC or the specialized tribunal if he were to likely be indicted?
Well, as I laid out earlier on, how likely, we see the very loud voices here calling for, in fact, President Biden said that, President Putin is a war criminal, that war crimes have been committed in Ukraine. And from the ordinary eyes, we all have blood running through our veins. We're human beings. We have humanity in us. You see people are bounded, their hands are bounded behind their backs and shot in the head in execution style, in close range. You see in places like Odessa, in Mariupol, in civilian corridors that were agreed upon jointly at peace talk were being interfered with. You see civilian infrastructure, hospitals, a theater, or some kind of religious site, journalists, people who are covered under the what they call Common Article 3 of all 4 Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols. You see these people have been impacted by this conflict. They've been harmed. It seems rather to be very randomly and sort of superfluously done. And these are elements of determining, against the principles of protection, of the system of protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure and protected classes under international law. We're seeing all of those violations. So the likelihood that there will be some very high energy calls for indictment of Mr. Putin being brought before some tribunal or the ICC for that matter, the likelihood is very high. I see that. Whether or not it will happen in short order, that I doubt. How is it going to happen? The how is what we have to watch and see. But I see the likelihood that this push will continue, the calls will continue. Until we saw videos and visual evidence recently of dead bodies all in the streets in these cities in Ukraine that have described the manners in which that we saw that they were killed. That's really what struck the nerves, like the Russians have crossed the line. Now, if you can execute civilians, evidence of mass graves, the kinds of destructions and just the inhumanity that Seemingly these Russian soldiers and the Russian military is meeting out against civilian population, civilian infrastructure, and protected classes in Ukraine. You don't have to be a brain scientist, a neurosurgeon, to know that this is going to lead to some kind of downfall of Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. You said that war has consequences, I should say, and these people are carrying on heinous crimes. I don't know of any war that will not take away the lives of individual in factions that will not be done according to this or will not be against the international humanitarian laws laid down. The point you made also is right that Joe Biden, president of the United States, referring to Vladimir Putin as a war criminal, right? That he has committed war crimes. But this very Joe Biden saw what happened in Iraq when George Bush, based on lies, there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They launched an onslaught in our country. Several thousands got killed. The same thing can be said about Afghanistan. Joe Biden, now president of the United States, was right here when these crimes, these killings, the bombings of civilians in localities were done by the Americans. He never called any of the U.S. president a war criminal. And of late, Barack Obama was the one who approved the onslaught that was carried on in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, who happened to be a sitting president of Libya, was slaughtered. Joe Biden did not call Obama a war criminal. Is this not a double standard to be calling Vladimir Putin a war criminal and would not muster the courage to call Obama and Bush for the same thing that Vladimir Putin is doing?
No, fair question. I mean, what I can say to that is this is geopolitics, Anthony. Geopolitics is about power. Geopolitics is about alliances. Even in history, all the wars we've seen, World War One, World War Two, you have allied forces. You have allies who went against the so-called Axis powers, right? And the Soviet Union was part of the Allied forces back then. It was part of the Allies back then. So your question of and now scholars have written extensively. It's in the literature, it's in legal precedents, it's in starting law schools, in graduate schools, in classrooms, everywhere. You can look at the research. There were loud calls that what was happening in Iraq. What happened in Iraq also constituted war crimes, violated the principles of law, of international law that I talked about earlier. Your principles of distinction, for example, the parties in the conflict, parties in any armed conflict are under obligation to distinguish protected classes from military necessity, from military objects or military or militarized individuals or infrastructure. And so, in other words, your war has to be about military necessity. It has to have military objectives, and you should have the most minimum impact on civilians and civilian human sufferings. You also, under the principle of precaution, you're under obligation to take precaution and clearly identify and delineate those protected classes and so forth and so on. Which are, frankly, very similar violations. So the Abu Ghraib, for example, prisoners of war were abused openly, U.S. soldiers. And that's part of the reasons why I have to tell you, my brother, that the United States is not a member of the ICC. It's not a member of the ICC. Also, in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, there's a famous article that talks about who killed Article 2.4, right? Where the United States was going around the world and basically twisting the arms of weaker countries, threatening them with withholding aid and cooperation if they cooperated with the ICC or if they joined the ICC, and that kind of backfired. You can look at what experts have said about that. That backfired, as you know, the U.S. is not is championing itself as a country of rule of law, but it doesn't care about international justice, and so it kind of slowed down. Essentially, when President Bush was in office, he communicated with the Secretary General Kofi Annan at the time that the United States no longer had intention to ratify the ICC statute. Uh, there were a number of efforts to hold American personnel and the leaders accountable for what happened in Iraq. But the case for the U.S. non-membership of the ICC is that it's what they call complementarity and compatibility of law. The United States argues that the ICC statute is against U.S. Constitution. That if you say,
and do you believe that?
Well, practically speaking, if you look at how the law is set up and how U.S. Constitutional law sort of talks about the type of freedom and liberty and the rule of law system, the institutions that are in the United States, which the exemplification of the constitutionality and the constitutionalism of the U.S. system. Yes, they can hold American citizens accountable. That's the argument there. We already have a system in place. We have legislations that says an American citizen who commits crimes abroad can be held accountable under our system nationally. Also, that the ICC statute.
If I may interrupt you there, so there is a U.S. howling beyond colorful words and phrases in their constitution and say, hey, we can't because we have a system in place yet, right? So any other country or every country can say that, then we will not have a body to look into the issue of war crimes and international humanitarian crimes, right? So that would be a bad, that has been a bad example on the part of the U.S. though.
Well, it may seem so. Let me back up. So even under ICC jurisdiction, the International Criminal Court jurisdiction, right, the ICC only has supremacy, which means it has jurisdictional right or jurisdiction or a matter if that country, the member state, is unable or unwilling to take action or prosecute the citizens who have committed war crimes or crimes against humanity, or of the categories of crimes that we're talking about here today. Right? So even other countries that are not the United States, right, and the jurisdictional setup of the ICC statute is such that the ICC only steps in when there's an unwillingness on the part of member states to take action, or that they don't have the wherewithal, the expertise, the abilities, the sort of they're not able, what are nice people or system-wide to be able to prosecute. So we saw, for instance, what happened in a case of Sierra Leone. They invited the United Nations to establish a hybrid court. So it's in partnership with the United Nations and international system because they did not have the capacity, they did not have what it needed to be able to prosecute the crimes that were committed in the Sierra Leone war. So yes, it's a bad example. There are a lot of other countries who were intimidated by the Article 214 incidents and the ICC incidents that I talked about, where the United States went around the world and fisting arms, but it backfired, and the U.S. back off of it, essentially, and just left it as is. And that they're not a member, but of late, we've seen the United States showing some signs of support to the ICC and not blocking things in the Security Council, for example, or abstaining on some actions and so on. So you saw in other instances that we talked about, you alluded to Obama in Libya. And so Security Council Resolution 1973 is what NATO-led nations, it led them to take action under the guise of implementing the Security Council's resolution to stop Muammar Gaddafi from massacring his own people who were protesting, so essentially to intervene in an internal strife that seemed that the government heavy-handedly was committing crimes against humanity and war crimes. So while the United States is protecting its citizens against the jurisdiction of the ICC, we've seen the U.S. to also be a very active participant in the protection of surveillance overseas and upholding international justice.
Well, I am curious here. What is this all about for the U.S. In this case, with Russia President Vladimir Putin? Is it about accountability? Is it about the rule of law? Is it about respect for international treaties? Is it about respect for international humanitarian laws? What is it about, or is it more about power play on the world stage between the U.S. and Russia? Yeah, I really don't see that, because U.S. has done similar thing that Russia is doing, and U.S. is mad and throwing out names that were criminal.
Listen, last time we talked about the United Nations as the premier organization that was set up following World War II to ensure and maintain international peace and security. And the U.S. does that through the very many agencies of the United Nations, arms of the United Nations, and the entire UN system. They do that quite well. But sometimes the UN is supplanted by geopolitics by superpower nations who are also all members of the Security Council. Uh, I mentioned earlier that this is about geopolitics and power play, power politics. And Sonny, you have to be a student of global politics to understand some of these things, right? It's all about the balance of power. It's about who controls what resources, who can do what to curtail whose powers, to forestall whose efforts to gain what. In this case, though, we have to say genuinely, it seems the United States, like many other nations, are really appalled by the conduct of the war. Not only is Russia in violation of the UN Charter by invading another sovereign state, an aggression against an unprovoked aggression against another sovereign state, a member state of the United Nations. That's crime number one. That's crime number one in the international protection system. And so, if you don't stop a nation like that, if you don't stop a head of state who seems to really be interested in expanding territory and illegally acquiring territories, and doesn't seem to care or doesn't take the necessary precautions or care to ensure that the impact of such adventure on surveillance and protected classes are very minimal or non-existent at all. It ought to concern everyone. Of course, Russia is a very powerful country. Over 40% of Western European countries receive the natural gas and oil and so on from Russia. So to many poor countries around the world, countries like Egypt, over 80% of their wheat come from Ukraine and Russia and that part of the world. There are countries in Africa who get maize and wheat from Russia. So this is a matter that concerns all of us. Earlier in the beginning of the show, you alluded to this to Liberian audiences that we ought to be talking about some of these international matters because they affects us as global politics that affects us. We're so interconnected by globalization and social media and information communication technology world today. So there are very many reasons why we see global leaders that the United States, like NATO countries, take actions to protect people who are vulnerable, the elderly, women and children, pregnant women. Think about somebody who's 95 years old. And you want them to destroy their home. They're not able to be a refugee. They're not able to struggle to get on the train and go to Poland and go to Hungary, Bulgaria, and some other place. It's difficult. It's just on the human level, just for humanity's sake. One can put politics aside and say, if countries like the United States, if institutions, global governments like the United Nations system don't step up to do something to stop what Russia is doing, the question is who's next? So it's also about global security, actually, the security of the United States itself, because Russia, as we said before, has the largest nuclear warheads, even than the U.S. itself, than
Thank
all
you.
the countries in Europe.
Thank you. You said it's about, power play. And the power play, I see that the U.S. Gets a little more selective here. It is more about what is in its interest uh, on the international stage, and that is all is more about compared to accountability and respecting the laws. Now, let me bring a case to you, like Liberia, right? We had a war that we are all aware of. We know the players that contributed to the war. The U.S. has done business with some of these people. In fact, in the Liberian war, United citizens were killed. It is obvious that the U.S. Is now making frantic efforts to see a criminal code established as it happened in Sierra Leone. The U.S. like, well, that's Liberian matter. You should decide, right? But it's not deciding. It's not allowing the people of Ukraine to decide what they want to do. It's involving, calling names, sending. The last time I checked, they approved, I think, around 13 to 14 billion dollars, right? I mean, so this is not about accountability. This is not about equal treatment of people. It's more about power play, and this exposes the U.S., isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, you can. It's an argument to make. It's a legitimate argument. One can also flip the argument and say what Russia is doing is power play. Putin at least wants to reestablish the Soviet Union, to reclaim Soviet territories. You have to remember all these countries, in the Baltic region, countries that are west and northwest of Ukraine, they were pretty much all Soviet Union countries. And Putin, being a former Soviet KGB guy who really grew up during that time and saw what power could do, and saw that collapse in 1991, has always not been happy about that. And so it's power play. He's trying to flex his hands. He has leverage. He has the oil. He has all kinds of resources. He's a nuclear power, and people. That's the reason why there's no-fly zone enforcement or even established. The West, Biden would not do it. Would not just do it because they say it could expand the war, extend it to other European countries. That would be World War III, essentially. And so the point is, Russia, any big nation like that with power, for natural resources, for territorial reasons, for global influence, or protection of its citizens, just for whatever reason that is strategic to its national security and its national interest, right? Look, this is American realism. Okay, you'll be a political science student will tell you that we believe in stepping up. We are realists at times. We are liberals at times. We believe in international institutions when it's to our advantage. We stop international institutions and take action and flex our muscles and exercise our own power when we think that that's where the advantage is. So you really just have to look at it and from the standpoint in which maybe this administration, President Biden, is looking at. How does it benefit the United States, or how does it secure the security of the United States? So there's not a one-size-fits-all sort of analysis one can deploy to this situation, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Your expertise and studies is also conflict transformation. I like the word conflict resolution more because there's a conflict here that needs to be resolved. And let me say this and get your take, right? The United States and its European allies are faced with a choice on Ukraine now, given what we're seeing. Now, they can continue on their current policy, which will exacerbate hostilities with Russia and devastate Ukraine in the process. Now, a scenario in which everyone will come out as the loser. If they can switch gear and work to create a most prosperous but neutral Ukraine, one that does not threaten Russia and allows the West to repair its relationship with Moscow, this might be a win-win situation. From your background, which way you think is best for the West, best for Russia, and best for Ukraine.
Okay, so for purposes of invoking conflict resolution or conflict transformation, as you've done, I will flag a theory to you and then attempt to answer your question. So there's a theory that says that uh, don't push the a belligerent party is back on the wall, right? You have to give an out. You have to allow that person to save face or that nation state to save face and easily extricate themselves, and therefore allow you meaning the opposing powers to to meet their own objectives as well. In other words, there's some sort of win-win possibility if you give an out, some ways that Putin can come and stop the aggression, and then you begin to negotiate in terms of, okay, so what's the status of Ukraine going forward? Now, I have to bring to your attention, and even before getting to that, a couple of weeks ago, maybe last week, President Zelensky and the negotiators, and, like his Foreign Minister Koliba and others in Turkey, they were talking about they're willing to put on the table that Ukraine will not seek its aspiration to join NATO, for example, but that Ukraine should be allowed to at least join the European Union. And Russia is still against even joining the European Union because other analysts and experts say that that would mean that a democratic Ukraine, a prosperous Ukraine, against all the tenets that we see in Russia, right? Very repressive, authoritarian state, strong man instead of strong hand, leading people, information control, and so on. Those are all against democratic principles and tenets. And Ukraine, on the other hand, wants to be more and more to the West, more and more to Western Europe, to be, in fact, member of the European Union. So, yes, Ukraine could eventually be a neutral country that doesn't have aspirations for a NATO membership. They've already said that that's a possibility, but that's not enough, in my view, for Putin's objective. That is just not enough for Putin's objective. So maybe Ukraine also has to give up aspirations to join the European Union and things like that. And that Ukraine has to be willing to give up the Donbass region, to give up Crimea, to give up territories that Russia has already has appropriated to itself.
Thank you. Yes. The other component here, I mean, is when we're talking about the war power play, you also have to negotiate in instances where you might want to accomplish certain things. When during Obama time, at some point, Obama needed some help, and he got that help from Vladimir Putin. And in Syria, they were able to put things under control. As we speak, because of the approach the U.S. is carrying on, along with European allies, you see now Vladimir Putin is cementing his relationship with China. So you look at these two powers, economic powers, Russia and then China. If you put them together, they might be like economically and geopolitically on the neck of America. That may not be good for Uncle Sam right now. If Uncle Sam was in a much better relationship with China, these things with Russia would have been much easier, because Vladimir Putin, to his credit, cemented his relationship with China. So all the sanctions, though we bite, but he have a little bit of a breathing room. Is the U.S. strategy here much appropriate here, in your opinion?
See, there's a thing called the tools of state, the tools of state power. Any head of state, any national major political actor ought to understand the tools of state power, and also the principle of statecraft. So the Americans engaging in statecraft, one, and two, America is utilizing the tools of state power. So we call them DIME, D-I-M-E. I told you about this before.
Right.
You can use your diplomacy, which is what you see Biden crisscrossing the Atlantic, going to Brussels and going to NATO capitals and so on. So they're utilizing that diplomacy. and Russia's engaging in information warfare, right? Psychological and deceptive information. That's a tool of state also. Military, well, obviously what's happening, Russia's doing in Ukraine. They're utilizing the military power as a tool of state to gain the strategic objective in their opinion. On the other hand, on the other side of the aisle, United States and NATO countries have different strategic objectives, and they're utilizing tools of states to be able to accomplish the objective. So those tools, be they economic, be they in information, as I said. So you just have to try to understand what is the strategic objective here. What is the military objective? China's objective, China has a Taiwan problem, that. And China kind of see Putin's moves in Ukraine, whether it's annexing Crimea or trying to appropriate Donbass and other eastern Ukrainian cities and regions. China might be thinking, we might as well, maybe at some point we will adopt similar doctrine as Putin is engaging in, and claim our islands, city-state that America and other countries are protecting. And so it's not just because a country wants to come to you and engage with you actively, strategically, that other country will be amenable and open to that. That country is looking at its strategic goals. China is looking at its strategic goal and say, maybe mine aligns more with Russia, and I'm going to be open to Russia. We don't know if there were behind-the-scenes diplomacy happening. The U.S. engages with China very strategically on a number of things. They will score them openly at times. They will cozy to them. China, so too will China, just depending on what each party wants to accomplish based on their national strategic objective. So it's not a black and white thing to say what America is doing, this strategy. You can analyze it as an analyst, as a reporter, as a media person, as a legal person. You can analyze it and say, I don't like this strategy. I don't understand it. From my sort of armchair anthropologist approach, I'm sitting way far. I'm just reading reports. I'm following media reports and things like that. That is my vantage point. That is the information that I have access to. I appropriate all this information and reach a certain conclusion. You might be right or wrong. Sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we don't. That's just the nature of things. So we can't say that maybe United States' approach will backfire because the strategy is flawed. We just don't know that.
Thank you. And I asked that question because I know you remember the U.S. was trying to withdraw from Afghanistan. We saw the chaos. If the U.S. had a much better relationship with Russia, they could use Russia and withdraw easily with Russia's help. All right. And that would have been.
How could that have happened? Russia, the Soviet Union was badly defeated in Afghanistan in history. So I'm just wondering.
You are in the field about diplomacy. It's about engagement. It's about deals making, right? It's not impossible. And
no, I agree. I'm just looking. I thought you had a strategic point, a strategic instance which you thought the United States missed that I was interested in. But let's move forward.
All right. Thank you, folks. You are watching the Hour of Politics. Anthony here, and we are discussing the topic. The Russian president, people are throwing charges of war crimes against him, and we are trying to look into that. I have Mr. Ahmed Sirleaf as my guest, who is helping us to understand this complicated topic. Is it possible for this man to be charged and prosecuted subsequently for war crimes? We will take a quick break. When we come back, we'll re-comment, and then if we have phone calls, we will also take the calls. A short break, and we will be right back, folks.
At Focus on Liberia, we discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Dennis Jah.
Thank you there, folks. We are back with you. We'll read your comments. This one is from Prince M. Double. Putu got himself a bunch of big guns. No one can take him to the ICC. Prince again, if Americans cannot go to the ICC, Putu cannot also go to the ICC. Very simple. Dr. Pajibo here writes that is according to the definition of war crime adopted in 1889 and ratified by many countries in 1907, Mr. Putu cannot be left off the hook. He has intentionally killed civilians during armed conflicts. This one is from Judah. He writes the same with almost American presidents. Prince again, if the American cannot be left off the hook for killing innocent people in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, why now Putin and his men? Dr. Pajiboya again, Mr. Putin has committed murder against unarmed civilians. He is carrying on extermination of cities, and there are reports of enslavement, taking Ukrainian citizens on Russian farms. Wow. Prince M. Double again, an American President Trump even threatened to arrest those judges from the ICC. Can you imagine that? Prince again, America did all that in Afghanistan, Libya, and Iraq. Why were they not sent to the ICC? Let's hear from Judah here again. The UN and the ICC are puppets of the West that only goes after leaders from third world countries. He writes, let's hear from Joseph here. Joseph Paul, look, the great people of Ukraine are very brave fighters to stand up to a mamad like Putin of Russia. He thought he would have run over Ukraine, but the great people of Ukraine told him that strong patriotism is greater than heavy armory, he writes. Let's hear from Wuwak here. I used to be a member of the church in Moravia. I left that church because I disagree with a prayer that pastor offered during service. In his prayer, he said that he comes against all Egyptians' beasts. So I opened my eyes and said to him, you're not able the small demons in Moravia.
Yeah. Like
Able and Sonny, please talk about lack of light at RIA and forget Putin and Ukraine. Well, we have talked about that. We had a show yesterday. We have about 3 different shows so far, and we will talk about it continuously. Let's hear from Prince again. Palestinians are being killed daily by Israel. No Western nation has talked about sending those Israelis to the ICC for killing innocent Palestinians. You know, the U.S. hypocrisy here is being exposed further. It will never happen with Putin. Biden already said that he doesn't want to provoke Putin because he cannot afford a war. He cannot afford a war in Europe. Let's hear from Emmanuel Charles. It will never happen with Putin. Biden read, I think that's the one I just read. I think he's repeating his comment over and over for it to be read. I think that's what he's doing. This is a different one. Putin has 6,000 nukes. Putin is not Charles Taylor, my friend. He writes. Lots of comment here. Let me see. Let me get to somebody different. Yeah, from James here. James, right? If George Bush and Tony Blair will go to the ICC, then Putin will go. So people are pointing out others who have engaged in similar armed conflict or authorized him or sponsored it, and they didn't go anywhere. And then Biden didn't say a thing about that, and now he's calling on Putin. How come? Does the ICC enforce war crime and economic crime concurrently? In addition, is there a rule or is there rules to adapt a new initiative in the new global war order? A person is asking that question. A few comments that from our viewers. Mr. Sirleaf, you can respond, please.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it's sort of a summation of the common thread across the comments there, the viewers, and thank you all for your active participation and very, very legitimate questions across the board, concerns. We've talked about some of this, answering to your question of seeming lack of accountability against or on the part of the United States against in its global practices, be they in Iraq or Afghanistan and other parts of the world. You know, hey, people, the United States is a country of freedom. That's the mantra of morality and constitutionalism principles here in this country, country of institutions, strong institutions, and rule of law. They say that. And so people have the right to question when they see the U.S. hasn't just exactly measure up to some of those national principles and some of the democratic tenets that it promotes, liberal democracy, democratic principles that it promotes abroad. Fair enough, right? But I would say each of these conflicts, now there's no denying that war crimes or elements of war crimes didn't happen, or some of the principles under the international humanitarian law protection system were invalidated. That's not what I'm here for. That's not what I'm here to say. All I have been pointing out is that we ought to be a little critical and look at each case by itself, because what they do in law, they say, listen, let's look at it on the merit, let's look at it on the fact, the evidence, and the law. So what happened in Iraq, we've discussed some of that a little bit, and information that we have previous to what we've read and studied and seen, and other nations condemned U.S. action in Iraq. They set up their own sort of tribunal in Iraq to investigate some of the alleged violations that happened in our country. Other international actors were saying that is not enough. We need for the same principles that you promote abroad or that are enshrined in the ICC constitutive statute. They ought to be enforced there. Well, but that is the very reason why the United States is not a member of the ICC, did not ratify the ICC statute, because it does not want its citizens to be subject to ICC jurisdiction. It believes that it has it's sort of more sophisticated legal system, court system, constitutional system that can hold people accountable, whether they committed crimes abroad or at home. That's the U.S.'s position. That aside from the ICC, a lot of other international treaties that the United States does not want to be part of, even those that the U.S. ratifies eventually, there are a disclaimer clause that the U.S. always puts in there that this is law as long as it's not in conflict with U.S. Constitution, or that is not doesn't have supremacy over United States jurisdiction, right? So that they have an out. They always, they have something to fall back to say, listen, we ratify this with exception. An exception is sort of a disclaimer. It's allowed in the treaty system, right? So that's the sort of American diplomacy, American sort of international practices. Different countries have different traditions. There's a thing called state practice in international law. Customary international law, state practice is a very major principle where a piece of principle that has now developed, which was not codified previously, but it has been practiced and in favored upon by a number of other member states of the UN. Those principles then can be brought into sort of ambience of codification and say, well, they can stand up in court. Why? Because they now become law as a result of what's called customary international law based on state practice. So the U.S. did not go to the ICC. President Bush, President Obama, all the parties that you've named, why now drag Putin to the ICC or perhaps organize another international tribunal for him? It's complicated. I said initially, I don't see how President Putin, while in office, can be brought. It could be indicted, but the international law system does not encourage trial in absentia. Does not encourage that. They really want to indict someone and arrest them and bring them before the court so that they can answer. They can have the time in court and be given due process. Just because we see horrific actions, we see horrific seeming violations, it's not as simple as that. Earlier I talked about you have to determine intent. You have to look at command and control. Greatest responsibility, individual culpability, individual responsibility. These legal people have all kinds of work on their hands to do, and to help the politicians and the diplomats to bring some of these things to bear here. And so let's watch and see. But across the board, some of the comments are legit. I specifically want to come back and comment on the new order, global new order thing that Mr. Keita pointed out, whether or not a new, I'm hoping, I'm trying to, I don't want to put words in that Mr. Keita's mouth, but I'm believing he's thinking, for instance, some of what we're seeing, like additional protocols to the Geneva Convention and so on. So has some state practice emerged enough now that state practice or those state practices then can constitute some sort of new world order? A lot of scholars are commenting that what Putin has done in Europe has strategically shifted global security, particularly European security, that it will never be the same again. Even NATO will never be the same again. Therefore, then Mr. Putin and Russia, they have realigned global security system, and hence you can argue that this is a new world order. Let's watch and see how this unfolds, how this settles.
Thank you. And Emmanuel Charles is asking, when you said that, 90 years old homes being destroyed, they can't go out, and he asking the question,
in Libya,
no 90 years old persons in Libya and Iraq.
I'm not an apologist into my job is to follow what's happening, to put in context and based on knowledge and experience, what I know, what I've studied, what I see other experts are saying, and be able to just to read something into it. When I get approached by people like Anthony C.A., Focus on Liberia, some other media people, some panel, I've been, I've been doing this now since how many times since this war started, right? So I'm not an apologist for the U.S. necessarily, and that's not. If it sort of came across as that, my point is to be objective and analyze these things based on the law and the evidence, what we're seeing, based on the security implications and so on. Yes, of course, civilians, in fact, going to Libya, the sole purpose of going to Libya, for which the United States pushed the Security Council to pass the resolution 1973. I think that's the name. That was the resolution that led then the Security Council sanctioning, at the request of the United States and NATO, that NATO countries can intervene and act and enforce that Security Council resolution so as to protect civilians. So yes, to protect the 95-year-olds there. Now, the argument that many Africans, and you can tell I'm an African, right? I'm from Liberia, have argued and said, listen, this is ridiculous. You had another objective. You must have had some other ulterior motive for pushing the Security Council to take action, because you didn't really protect civilians. You came after Gaddafi, you removed Gaddafi from office, and see where Libya is today. Libya is in more turmoil. Vulnerable population, protected classes that are protected under the international law, the collective protection system, they were all impacted. So negative impacts on civilians. There's been no peace. There's been no organized central government system to promote good practices of governance and so on. So I agree with that point. to extend sadly the stated objective and the actions that happen in Libya, but not sort of the internally inconsistent with each other. I can see how the argument is legitimate. In Afghanistan, this is not for me to say. We all have seen and read, and what happened there were unfolded to the point where President Biden said, "Listen, we can't continue this. We have to pull our people out." We've tried to institute democracy in this country. It just has not worked. The U.S. realized it's now a rule. We can support in other ways and pull out. So others say, "Well, okay, you came after Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, you removed him and killed him, and so on, in the protection of the U.S. But see what's happened in Afghanistan. Ordinary people. The Taliban has come to power again. Therefore, what was the purpose of all the collateral and mistaken killings of civilians and suffering that we've seen in Afghanistan and other places?" So, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to step back to come back to that comment and say,
thank
I'm
you.
not an apologist for any country. My role is just to really look at it, try to answer your questions as best as I can based on knowledge and the evidence.
And Ahmed, before I get your closing statement, I have this final question here. Is the West, America in particular, using or hurling beyond democracy, a promotion of democracy, to just have a will of control for many other countries? I'm asking the question because studies have shown that democracy is not the only form of governance for any country or society. But this is America. Democracy is more embedded with its culture, and it's like trying to force it in the throat of some other nations. Libya, for example, you articulated so succinctly here. They said they were doing it in the name of democracy, and where there's democracy now in Libya, one chaos after the other. And many other African countries we can talk about. And when they force it, they turn their back and they think that it's going to flourish. But we've seen other countries in the world where democracy is not practiced as the U.S. wants it, right? And these countries are stable. So it's about time now that the U.S., review and revisit their approach of democracy for countries around the world as a way of maintaining peace and stability and the rights for human beings in those countries?
Well, Anthony, I think it's fair for us to dabble into politics. So this is the hour of politics, right? So that's a fair question. And see what's happening to liberal democracy in the United States of America itself with Donald Trump. See what Donald Trump did to this country. For the first time, I think it was President Obama who had said the Trump administration, Donald Trump's personal actions and disregard for rule of law and the flagrant violations of institutional practices shows that democracy is more fragile than we ever thought. At least democracy, American sort of version of liberal democracy and the tenets that it promotes, the rule of law, so counterbalance institutions that sort of balance each other and double counter check each other, elections and electoral credibility, respect for freedoms and things like that, and the human individual liberties and so on. Those are the tenets that they bring to us in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and say, you don't know how to hold elections. You want to stay in office for more than your term limits. You have to craft your constitution so that it reflects, it mimics what the U.S. Constitution looks like and embed these principles. And we expect and hold you to these principles, and so forth and so on. And so what happens? We see African countries draft constitutions, but there's no constitutionalism. People do things the way I guess sometimes the culture, the politics, whether it's the tribal or regional, and the configuration or economic factors are driving politics locally. And that's what folks do. In Rwanda, the West has been on Kagame's case and say, listen, you can't be the only most qualified and perfect Rwandese to lead this country. Kagame says, my people are happy. They're prosperous. The country is growing. There's the Singapore of Africa. Why are you bad? They're not saying Kagame go and go. Then there's also, well, oh, what about all the human rights violations and abuses? He say, how about your country? In America, that's how, if you watch Paul Kagame, that's sort of how he deflects and counter argues, right? So what a democracy is a decoy, is a cover. It's left for the jury is still out on it, I would think. I mean, the question even is, critical scholars ask, what is this democracy in the first place? In Liberia, we say flagrant democracy. You pray tell me now, flagrant democracy, in our country. What? All right, yeah, all right. We have institutions. You have the system of government. There's a judiciary, which should be independent. There's the executive, the legislature, and we have things that mimic government institutions, and you see in other countries whether they function, they have the capacity to protect the citizens and give people their rights, protect people their rights, and make sure that they ensure basic services. The social contract is implemented. Do they even respect the social contract? There's so many things. And it's true in many other countries that have similar profiles as ours. In Sub-Saharan Africa, Asian countries, what we're seeing in Russia in terms of Russia being viewed as an authoritarian state, anti-democratic state. So democracy, like any other form of governance, I think it just really is left to the people to view it and understand in their own context, how is it that we can make this place better and grow and give people opportunity in a way that we don't abuse citizens' rights and say it's in the name of this or not in the name of this. There are many other forms of government. Monarchies, for example, around the world. There are other countries, kings and queens are ruling. You have parliamentary system in the UK. Prime Minister has the government, then you have a head of state. And so democracy hasn't been the only model that has been successful, although some monarchies like to say we are a constitutional monarchy.
Right.
In other words, we're a democratic system or democratic state. So I don't know how to answer that question. Sorry, I ramble on it, but
the thing is something that we can discuss in a whole
another time, another hour of politics.
Exactly. And Ahmed, we want to say thank you so much for coming and giving your perspective and deeper understanding on this whole issue of Vladimir Putin, world leaders wanting him to be charged for war crimes and also see him to face the any tribunal for that matter for the crimes that he's been accused of, similar crimes that they accused of Bush, Obama, and other world leaders. There was no appetite. And so how can that be possible for Vladimir Putin? We can only wait to see. And folks, we needed to discuss this because in Liberia, we saw war crimes. We didn't see the U.S. exerting its muscles that much. And while the Americans died in that war too, but we've seen that the current U.S. president, Joe Biden, is all over the place and he wants to see this happen. Now, when they push him for it, they say, whoa, this is not regime change. So then how are you going to do it? Right? And if Putin remains in power, he controls the military. How is that even going to happen? In small country like Liberia, you can't even make it happen that you can, really push things through. So it's based on interest. It's not about accountability. It's not more so about rule of law. It's about control, power and control, they call it. Mr. Ahmed Sirleaf is a global policy and conflict specialist. He is also a security and public international law specialist, and he could not have been well placed for the discussion. Ahmed, again, we want to say thank you. What is your closing statement? Do you have any prediction? How do you look at it?
Well, I want to thank you, first of all, for inviting me again. It's always a pleasure to come to contribute to your conversations here. Focus on Liberia. I like how you're growing, you're thinking outside the box and diversifying. I really like that. That's why I keep coming here. So I take you as a serious forum on which we can, have very serious conversations. Couple of things. One, I want to agree with you that it's appropriate for us as Liberians to engage in these types of global conversations. It has implications. We're already seeing some contraction, very serious in our economy in Liberia. Rice crisis, seeming apparent lack of rice on the market. I have called for us. It's not as simple as that, but growing what we eat. I really strongly believe in that, right? And as I said, other countries in Africa, the major staple foods are grown in Ukraine, in Russia. There's global macroeconomic implications in this. So I think that it's important as a result, and because of us also having that we fought war before, it's good for us to understand these issues. And so that's why I agree to be here and discuss this topic. Closing thought on my prediction, whether I'll see Putin before an ICC or in some kind of specialized tribunal. I see a possibility of an investigation for war crimes and that's already ongoing in Ukraine, and there's some conclusion that indeed war crimes are committed. To prove certain specific crimes or allegations of war crimes, however, will be difficult. As I said, intent is a big part of the criminal law jurisprudence. And so you have to figure out whether that general gave order to soldiers to fire the certain unallowed weapons in indiscriminate ways at civilians and civilians infrastructure and so on. You have to prove that was the plan. It wasn't accidental, essentially, because mistakes happen. It's called collateral damage. I'm not saying what's happening is collateral damage, but I'm just saying there's some legal and technical pieces there that they will have to work out. But ultimately, I do believe we will find the evidence will show that indeed war crimes are committed in Ukraine, and that individuals will be culpable, individuals will be indicted, individuals will be held accountable. How soon it will happen, I can't predict that. Whether Putin himself will be indicted, he might linger around. As long as he's in power, it'll be difficult to get him before any court. You might indict him absentially, but you will not try him absentially, if I can pronounce the word. And so maybe the next move would be to try to undermine his administration, his regime, his government, so the Russian people can rise against him, because the impact of all the sanctions, all the restrictions against Russia will really bite the Russian citizens, the ordinary people. And so Putin has some really juggling and decisions to make, right? I don't think that he will go scot-free altogether. But others are even predicting that this might be the beginning of the end of the Putin regime in Russia. Who knows? Might be the case. But we're still watching. We're still collecting the evidence. And maybe next time when something big happens, we'll see some big trends and changes. We can come and talk about those. So thank you so very much again for inviting me. I enjoyed it. I want to thank the participants who were very active, gave very critical comments. I enjoyed it. I think it enriched the conversation. So I want to thank you and all your viewers and your participants in this program today.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. And we enjoy the discussion and the answers you provided to what is more like a serious international issue. And I think our viewers are leaving and getting a better understanding of what may happen or what may not happen. Folks, this is how we will come to the end of this edition of the Hour of Politics. Before we can take leave of you, I want to advertise here. Focus on Liberia, starting tomorrow, will be live on the radio in Liberia. We have a deal with Prime FM. Prime FM every Saturday. Focus on Liberia will be live 9 p.m. GMT in Liberia to 11 p.m. GMT. So every Saturday we get 2 hours to be on Prime FM. That is 105.5 in Liberia, and that will be 3 p.m. Eastern time here in the U.S. You don't want to miss it. And the program name is also called Focus on Liberia. The topic for this Saturday discussion, which is the debut, is state-owned enterprises roles in today's Liberia. For the caller, the viewer who are asking why we're not discussing LEC. LEC, part of the state owned enterprise, talking about even the airport is state owned. We're going to talk about that. What are their role? Should they be generating revenue and they not? Why do we have them? Why is government paying salaries for the institution anyway, when they should be independent, raise revenue for national government, and contribute to so many developments in our country? Why? You want to find the answers. You don't want to miss it tomorrow. 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. GMT, live here on Focus on Liberia and live on the radio in Liberia, Prime FM. You don't want to miss it. Amen. We're making strides. The people will be hearing you on the radio soon in Liberia.
Who knows? Thank you.
Yeah. So, folks, this is how we will close the curtain now. We will say to you, bye-bye, and we'll see you another time.
At Focus on Liberia, we discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.